I've got one real topic today, and that's photo editing. We've done a bit over the last few weeks, just various adjustments, so alignments, straightening horizons, and then cropping and the guides that you can use for cropping and bits and bobs like that. I thought we'd go just one level deeper this time. Let me just mute you all. I've got mute all. There you go. So I thought we'd go just one level deeper this time. I'm not going to go too deep. It's not going to be too techie or drastic. Obviously, I'm just going to skim over the surface of some of the stuff. And as with all of these things, I'm going to show you some ways of doing stuff, but there's probably half a dozen ways of doing the same thing even in the same software package, let alone different software packages. So, I'll show you one way, but there will be other ways to achieve the same result. So, you just use it as a guide, a way of starting to think about how you might do these things, and then find your own way. And whatever way works for you is the best way. So what I was going to do is, as we've done the adjustments so far, they've all been global adjustments to the entire picture. So I thought it might be useful to show you how you make selective adjustments just to parts of the picture. Now this goes some way to doing full-blown cutouts and composites of other photos, but I'm not going to go that far today. I think, I'll go far enough that your ears will probably bleed. I don't want to go too far so your head explodes. So I'm just going to take you into the way you do selective adjustments in both Lightroom and Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 3 photos and I'm going to adjust them in Lightroom, and then I'll do the same 3 photos and adjust them in Photoshop. And I'm going to do them that way rather than alternate back and forth with Lightroom and Photoshop. I'm going to do it that way because Lightroom does things slightly differently to Photoshop. And I think from a headspace point of view, it might be easier if we deal with them separately. And then you'll see how one does similar things, but in the 2 different packages. And if you're not using either Lightroom or Photoshop, many of the other packages out there do things in a rather similar way. So as long as you get the broad concept of how to go about something, there will be something equivalent in the software that you use. And even if you use some of the same terminology, so for example, if you look at masks, we'll be using masks later. If you search for masks on your bit of software, if they don't call it masks, they'll tell you what they call it, but it'll be the same thing so that you can achieve the same result. And then at the end, I'm going to set you a challenge. And you can blame Paul Roberts for this challenge because what he suggested, which I think is a great idea, is why don't we all take the same photo and we all have a go at editing it, and then you submit your edits of that photo to me and I'll put it up in a gallery so that we can see what each of us have had achieved with the same photo. Does that sound like fun? You can't speak, so just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Yeah, scary. And if you don't want to do it, don't do it. Yeah, there's no obligation here. You don't have to do it. But I thought, and Paul's suggestion I thought was a good one. And I thought, well, that's not a bad little challenge for everyone. If you're getting bored, have a go at editing this photo. Do what you want. Have a go at it, whether they're subtle adjustments like I'm going to take you through today, or radical adjustments, entirely up to you. It might be fun just to see what each of us do. No prizes, it's just a bit of fun. So, what I'm going to do is share my screen now and we'll dive into Lightroom. and you should see what's now probably becoming a familiar view in Lightroom. I'm in the library view, you see that there, and I've got 3 thumbnails for the 3 photos I'm going to work on. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go into the develop mode on the first picture, and here we are. The first thing I can see is it probably needs a little bit of straightening, so I'm going to just tweak that like that, give or take. And then I thought it might be, there's a little bit of haze in this, so I thought it might be good to take out some of the haze. So these are global adjustments I'm doing, so I'm going to take out some of the haze like that. That's a bit better, yeah. But it's all a bit uniform, and the reason I took this photo was that I thought the cottages in the middle gave a real good sense of depth, and I thought, well, I wonder if we can enhance that anyway. So one of the things you can do in Lightroom is use what's called a radial filter, and you'll find the radial filter up here I'm in the develop module, and hang on, I'm just going to hide all these thumbnails, and you'll find these tools around here are the ones that we're going to be using. And if I stop and hover over it, it should pop up and say that's the radial filter. So I'm going to choose the radial filter for this, and the radial filter is just what it says, it's a radius, so it's a circle. So I'm going to go to the center point of these cottages and click and hold, and now I'm drawing out a circle that's kind of roughly where I want it to be. And you'll notice it's made like a desaturation adjustment. So if I come over to here, you'll see that the saturation is down at -50, and that's why it's desaturated. But the principle here is what I've selected in the middle is normal. The rest of it I've applied a radial mask to. I'm going to use the word mask, but I don't want to change saturation, so I'll zero that out. But what I do want to do is I want to drop the exposure a little bit. So I'm just going to drop it half a stop. So -0.5 stop there. And you'll notice now that this is all a little bit darker, just half a stop, than this bit. And that's because this is protected, and this is the masked area. So I'm applying these controls here to the mask. So that's that. I could desaturate, I could take out the color of that bit, I could change the contrast, I could up the whites, I can do all sorts of things once I've drawn the area that I want. But for this, I'm going to start simple. I just want to brighten up the center point, the buildings, just to see what it looks like. So if I turn that off now, you'll see that if I actually turn it on and off, so off, on, off, on, you'll see that actually, I believe that makes a slightly better picture, in that now the buildings in the middle have been highlighted. And that was, I mean, it's taken me a minute or two to describe it to you, but actually, once you know how to do this, it's seconds to make such a simple change. And if we actually hover over this area, it will show us the mask. So all the red tinted area is the area that's being affected by the controls, the sliders over here. If you want to show the mask all the time, there's a little tick box to do that, and it should show it while you're making adjustments. So that's the first photo I wanted to do. So let me go back to the library now. And that's a very simple radial filter that's applying a mask to the photo. This picture is a picture of the mosque in the main mosque in Istanbul. And what I wanted to do was to take a look. I'm going to reset everything, done and reset. There, that's what the original photo looks like. And you can see that the foreground, the people, the foreground is all a little bit dark because the camera is exposed for the sky. It was the camera's fault, not mine. I wouldn't do such a thing, obviously. But here we are. The exposure has been done for the sky, not for the foreground. So we've got a bit of a contrasty picture. So how could we adjust that? Now what I'm going to use for that is a linear filter. So if I come up here and I hover over this one, it should say it's a graduated filter. And if I come down to, sorry, I need to select that. And then so I've got similar slider controls over here, but I need to put where I want it to happen. Now, you can change the angle that this will apply, but if you hold the Shift key down, and I'm going to draw it upwards, it will apply it from in kind of reverse way, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So let's just zero out the saturation, and now let's just I want to change the kind of adjustments I make to luminance. So you'll see here there's something called a range mask, and what that's doing is saying that the mask is going to be applied in a particular way. And if I click on the drop down, you'll see that we've got some choices: color, luminance, and depth. And depth is grayed out. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. For this particular adjustment, I'm going to choose luminance. So if you like, that's how bright the image is. I'm going to click on the eyedropper, and I'm going to come over, and I'm going to select an area of the sky like that. And then I'm going to adjust the exposure. And what you should see is that the area of the sky up here, where I sampled, is not changing at all. But actually, when I toggle it on and off, the building and the foreground are being adjusted. And I've increased the exposure to up the brightness of those items. Yeah? So by doing this graduated filter, I'm basically saying from around about here upwards, I want you to apply, not apply rather, the increased exposure that I've done here. If I'd have dragged the box downwards, it would have worked the other way. It would have applied this adjustment to the beginning of the drag towards the end. Whereas because I drew it up, it went from the beginning to the end. So this is where all the adjustment was made. It takes a little while to get it into your head that that's the way it works. But what's the worst that can happen? If you do it and it's not the way you want it, you undo it and do it again the other way until you get it the way you want it. So again, turning it on means that I've now got my picture the way I want it. So that's applying a filter, a graduated filter, and using it to boost the exposure of a dark area. So let me go back to the library. And the last picture I wanted to look at in Lightroom is this one. And you may recognize this picture because it was the entry I made into the project vote, which none of you voted for. I'm not bitter or twisted. I just noted it. I've written it all down. I'll remember. So here we go. Now this is okay. This is out of the camera. But actually what I want to do is to de-emphasize the background a little bit so that the fig leaf and the fig fruit stand out a little bit more. So these are subtle adjustments that I want to do. And what I'm going to do first, and this may seem a little bit odd, is I'm going to adjust everything now for the background, and then I'm going to bring back the fig and the fruit, the fig leaf and the fig fruit. So first thing I'm going to do is some basic adjustments to this photo. So here's the basic adjustments, and we covered some of these in previous sessions. I'm going to take the exposure down a stop, so -1 stop. I'm going to take the contrast down about -50. That softens it. The clarity down -50. That softens the edges even more. And maybe the saturation, I want to make it a bit warmer, the background. So I'm going to go +50 on that to make it a bit warmer. So that's softened everything. It's underexposed it slightly, and it's warmed the colour up slightly. Now I want to bring the fig leaf and the fig fruit back. And so I'm going to make a selective adjustment now to those areas. And to do that, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to use the adjustment brush. If I hover over it, it will call it the adjustment brush. And now I get the same kind of sliders again. Now the adjustment brush is a brush that you literally paint with. And normally, if I wanted to paint this, I would have to paint every particular edge very carefully to make sure that I got exactly the right match and it didn't spill or bleed over into the edge of the background. But Lightroom helps you here, and it's got a sexy little feature that not a lot of people realize, and I'm going to demonstrate to you now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to undo the adjustments I did at the beginning. So the exposure I did -1, so I've got to up it, and I want to up it a bit more than it was. So I'm going to do +2. The contrast I took down by 50, so now I'm going to go +50. The clarity I took down by 50, so I'm going to go +50. And the saturation, I went -50, +50. I'm now going to do -50 again. All right, so I've now undone in these sliders what I did previously to the whole picture, and I've added a little bit more to the exposure to brighten things up. So now I need to paint that back on here on the fig leaf. But the little sexy feature I was referring to is over here, and it's called Auto Mask. And if you have that turned on, you'll see what happens in a moment. Now I can change things, the feathering, how much aggressive the flow is, how aggressive the changes are applied. You can ease them off a little bit, the size of the brush and all that kind of stuff. But the auto mask is the interesting thing. And what that does, you'll notice I've got quite a large brush here that's spilling over the edges, right? Normally you'd think, oh, you want a very, very tiny brush and very delicately paint around the edges. But because I've got auto mask turned on, what I'm going to do is paint in a different way. As long as the plus, you see in the center of the brush, there's a little plus symbol. As long as I keep that within the bounds of this leaf, i.e. I don't go over the edge here, as long as I stay somewhere inside it, you'll see what happens. So I'm going to start painting now. You'll notice that it's painting inside, but it's not going over the edge. It's detecting where the edge is. And that is the auto mask tick box that I've already put on. So you'll see I'm using quite a big brush. I'm not taking an awful lot of care in what I'm doing. I'm going to let go now and click again so I can stop and start. And if I go back here and start again, it doesn't change. So it's not an additive process. It's a one-off process that I'm applying to the leaves. And now bear in mind, for demo purposes, I'm rushing a little bit. As long as I stay within the leaf and with the plus sign, and I don't stray outside, then the auto mask keeps everything sweet for me. And now I've brought back the leaf and the fruit. And if I turn it off, that's the background I've changed and made it warmer. And now I've brought out the leaf. And if I reset the whole thing so it goes back to the original, you'll see what the change was. So those were the adjustments that I wanted to show you in Lightroom. Now, as I said, Lightroom does things in a slightly different way to Photoshop and maybe some of the other packages. You can do the same things, but you go about things in a slightly different way normally. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the same 3 photos, but I'm going to use Photoshop. Let me just get rid of this. I'm launching it from Lightroom, but I'm only going to share the screen. I can only share one screen at a time unless I share the entire computer, which I didn't particularly want to do. So you should now be seeing the same photo that we had before, that we started with. Now with Photoshop, it's slightly more difficult to get your head around, but it's very much more powerful. So I will demonstrate some of that as we go. The first thing to do in Photoshop, pretty much always, is to duplicate the layer that you've got so that you're not doing everything on one layer. So if you come over to the right hand side here, here are my layers, and I've just got the single background layer of the image that I've loaded. There are many ways of duplicating. I can right click and duplicate. I can drag and drop. For now, I'll just right click so you can see what I'm doing. I'm duplicating the layer. I'll leave its name as background copy, but you can rename it if you want to. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that layer off. This is little I here is to turn it off so that you can see what I'm doing underneath it. So I'm now going to select the background layer again, and I'm going to add an exposure change to it. So I do that from this little menu here, and I can select exposure. And it's added an exposure layer for me. And up here, I can change the exposure. And you may remember, I did minus 0.5 before on this picture. And that's dropped down the exposure a bit. If I turn that on and off, you can see how much that's changed. Not too aggressive. And then I want to now add a marquee around the cottage so that I can create my mask. So I'm going back to the top layer and I'm turning it on, and you'll notice that it's brighter. And that's because the layer underneath has now got a minus 0.5 exposure on it. When I turn the layer on top, that hasn't got the exposure change on, so everything brightens up. So now I'm going to use the marquee tool, which is this one here. And I'm going to use the elliptical marquee. And as before, I'm going to draw a little circle around the buildings. And up here, it's got a feather of 20 pixels. And all that means is that this edge around here is going to be fuzzy. And that means that the changes I make should blend in a little bit easier than if there was a dead hard, sharp edge to it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that elliptical thing into a mask. And there's a button to do that. Come down here, and here is the mask button. And if I click on it, hey presto, it's created my mask. And you'll see here, I've now got two little icons together, and this one is the mask. And you'll see that we've now got a brighter spot in the middle. And the easiest way for me to do that is if I group these together. Don't worry about what I'm doing, I'm just grouping them so that I can turn them all on, and I'll call it my edits. So now I've grouped all of my edits together so that I can turn them all on and off at the same time. So now you'll see the difference. Now it looks a bit aggressive and a bit weird at the moment, but actually after a moment or two, your eyes adjust to it and it just makes those buildings pop a little bit. And if you want to see the mask over here, as before, we saw the mask in Lightroom as a big red thing. Here, I can display it on its own. And this is an important thing to look at because you'll see the fuzzy edge. That's the 20 pixel fuzzy edge that I talked about, the feathering. But because this is editable, I can paint on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting or editing my mask using a brush. So I'm going to select the brush tool over here. I'm going to make sure I've got black or white because the mask uses black or white. And again, if I display it, you'll see that black hides it and white shows it. So if I paint black, I'm going to hide something. If I paint white, I'm going to show it. And I'll demonstrate that to you. This is one of the elements where it's a lot more powerful in Photoshop because you have very, very precise control. So I've got the brush selected. I've got the color black selected. So that's going to hide it. I now select over here the mask. And now I can paint with a very small brush in there. And you'll see the grass of the lawn is actually darkening up a little bit because you're now seeing it, the one I adjusted. If I now go back to the mask and show you the mask, you'll see the bits that I painted. And that's what happens, that they hide so the dark bit underneath shines through. So using masks in Photoshop is a little bit more technical, a little bit more complicated to achieve. But once you've got it in your head and you can do it quickly, like I've been doing today, you can see how much more powerful it is because you can go in and edit. Now you'll see these edges are quite sharp because I was painting with a brush and no feathering. But if I don't like that, what I can do is I can use the blur tool and I can soften those edges just by painting the blur over the mask. And now you'll see that those edges are softening up a little bit, so that when I go back to my picture, the edits I've made with my brush are less obvious and they're a little bit more feathered, a little bit more fuzzy. So all the tools you can use with painting, like blur and stuff like that, you can apply to the mask, and you can get extremely precise with it by using different size brushes. And you can even use different colors. Now, before your brain completely explodes, I could paint gray in here. And what do you think gray does? Well, you can probably work it out. If black hides it and white shows it, gray is somewhere in the middle. So it's a way of being much more subtle and controlling about what you're masking and what you're not masking, and how aggressively you're applying that. So masks in Photoshop are extremely powerful, even though when you're first trying to learn them, it all looks a little bit more complicated. And it is slightly more complicated than Lightroom. Lightroom has done it to do the majority of the work you want to do. Quick, fast production of getting the edits done. And you can do that in Photoshop if you're practiced at doing it. But if you're not practiced at doing it, Lightroom's far better for those kind of changes. But once you are practiced at doing it in Photoshop, Photoshop is extremely powerful and much more sophisticated in the way that you can achieve different results. Okay, now let me open the mosque picture. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the layer again. So I'm going to right click and duplicate. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a selection of this photo using the quick selection tool. And the quick selection tool is this one up here. And what I can do by painting is I can select this, and up here, because I'm on the middle icon which says plus on it, it means every time I let go of the mouse and re-click, it will add to the selection. I can also take away little tiny bits from the selection if I want to. But today I'm just going to be adding. If I don't slip up, we should be all right. So there. And now I'm going to convert that into a mask. And if you remember, I did that by using this little tool down here. And there's my mask. Now at the moment, it doesn't look any different because the picture underneath, the background picture, is exactly the same as the one on top. So the mask is not doing anything. Let's take a look at the mask. Well, that's not bad. Now again, if I want to do any refinements, I can just go in and paint with the black or white brush, as small or as large as I need to get the detail that I'm looking for. So now I've masked that. So now I'm going to apply an exposure to the top. But you'll notice that that's applied it to the sky, and I didn't want it to the sky. I only wanted it to the foreground. And the little trick I can do there is if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your keyboard, you'll see the icon change. If I hover over the two layers and press that key, if I click that, what it does is it says this adjustment that I've made will only apply to the mask. And you can see now, if I group these two together and turn it on and off, you'll notice that the change has just been made to the foreground. And that's the way you do a similar thing in Photoshop as I did in Lightroom. Now again, it didn't take me too long to do that. Sure, I'm practiced at doing this, but if you can master these techniques, and it does take a little while to get your head around these layers, the masks, the black and the white thing, and then just applying changes just to one layer and not the whole picture. These are learning things that you need to grasp, and it takes time. You won't expect to do it quickly, but what I'm doing is just showing you that you can do it, and if you do it, you can be much more precise, much more accurate about a lot of this stuff than you can in Lightroom. And again, let's now take a look at the fig picture. Same old routine. Let's duplicate the layer. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off that duplicate for now, because I want to make some adjustments to the background layer. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a bit of a blur, because what I want to do is I want to de-emphasize the background. Now in the Lightroom, I was using the clarity and the sharpness controls. Here, I'm going to apply a little bit of a blur. And I do that with a filter called Blur. Hang on, that one. And a Gaussian blur. And Gaussian just means random in this context. You can change how much the blur is going to be applied, and you get a little preview up here to show you. If I come over, actually if I come over to there, you'll see if I have lots of blur and less blur, I'm actually just going to go for about 3 pixel blur on this. Just a little bit of subtle blur. And now, as before, you remember I changed the color of the background when I did it in Lightroom. I'm going to do that with a filter. I'm going to add a photo filter layer, and that color is going to be orange. And you'll see that that's just added a subtle on, off, on, off. I can make it stronger if I want to, but I think, you know, there and about there is about right. It's a nice little subtle warmness to the background. The other thing I did in Lightroom was I reduced the exposure slightly on the background. I knocked it back a little bit. So let me do that. I'm going to add another adjustment layer, this time on exposure. And I did a -1. So that's knocked back the exposure a little bit. Okay, so now let's turn back on the top layer. And that's the difference I've made. Off, on. Now I'm going to adjust this layer. And what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to come up here and you'll see there's a select and mask button up here. So I'm going to select that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting like I did before. And being careful to keep it only within the bounds of the leaf that I want to adjust. And okay that. And you'll see now that it's created a mask. And if I look at that mask, that's the mask it's created around the object. And again, if I group those together, so you can see my edits on and off, that's the original, that's what I've done. So I've just subtly backed off the background to highlight the object of the picture. So, anyone got bleeding ears yet? I've unmuted you all, so you can now scream at me. I know I was going fast, and it all looked a little bit hairy for some people, but what I've tried to do is just sow the seed with you of the kind of things you can do with the two different software packages. And obviously, if you don't have either of those, maybe just sow the seed so that you know where to go look within your software to find those kind of things. Still can't hear you, Kevin.
Yeah. It's Kevin, I can't see him.
Yeah. You can use the chat window if you want to.
Very interesting, Ray.
Oh yeah, Kevin, you have asked me a question. Can you zoom into the mask and then use the brushes? Yes, you can. And if I go back to this particular if I expand out and I zoom in, you can see the mask there. And what I could now do, of course, is to go in, if I edit the mask, I can go in with a brush and I'm going to change it to white, so that will remove the mask, and you'll see there what it should look like. And if I now change it to black and make the brush much smaller, I can come in very carefully and accurately. Whoop, I didn't mean to do that. My graphics tablet is broke, so I'm using a crappy old mouse, so forgive me. My birthday soon.
Shows the internet.
Guess what's on my birthday present list? A nice shiny new Wacom tablet. And then I paint out all of that. And now I've got a much sharper, if I look at the mask now, you'll see that that's much sharper there than some of these here. But that sharpness itself may be a bit too sharp. So what I can do, again, is using the blur brush is just soften that up a little bit so that it gives me a nice finish. So to answer your question, Kevin, yes, you can zoom in. How do we group the layers on the Mac and using an old version of Photoshop? You group the layers in exactly the same way. I have to keep flipping back and forth between screen sharing so that I can read the chat, which is annoying. How do you do grouping? Let me don't know how to ungroup.
No, it's layers.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
So let me get rid of that. So here are the layers that I created. How do I turn those into a group? No matter what version of Photoshop you're on, you should be able to select the first one, shift select the last one, so they're all selected now. And then down here, there is a group tab, create new group, or you should be able to right click and group from layers. But either of those should create a group for you, and you can call it what you like. And groups are actually quite useful because you can, for example, you might have a couple of different treatments. You might make the background blue in one treatment and the background yellow in another. You can have these groups with these different treatments, and you can expand them and contract them as you wish. But the good thing is you can turn them on and off just by clicking one single eye symbol. So groups are quite handy to organize your layers in Photoshop. Any other questions? Yes, Andrew.
On the house, why didn't you just mask on the layer on the mask that was created with the adjustment layer?
Why didn't I mask? Because I didn't. I have no idea
Right.
why. Like I said, there's a dozen or more ways in every action, particularly Photoshop. I could have masked the sky and then inverted it. I could have, there are a number of different.
No, not the mosque one. The two houses in the middle. The house.
Oh, right.
When you created the adjustment layer, it created a mask with it, and you could have just painted in the middle of that with the brush.
Yeah. Yes, I could have. Yes.
Yeah. No.
It's whatever turns your handle, really. But yeah, there are always a number of ways of doing things. And you're right in that sometimes you do 6 steps to do something when actually, if only you knew, 1 step would have done it. And you created a Photoshop file with dozens of layers in when actually only a couple would have done the job. But that's all down to experience and the way you think and the way you approach stuff. And sometimes I approach photos, I've no idea what edits I'm going to make. I just approach it, start playing around, tweaking until I get a result that I'm pleased with. If you then go back and start again, maybe there would have been a quicker, more efficient way to do it. But it's kind of an organic process for me a lot of the time. But then again, I don't do selective adjustments like this very often.
No.
I try not to. You try and get it right in camera where possible.
You ever use smart objects?
Smart objects are good. They allow you to make changes and treat the whole thing as a separate entity. Yes, I do use smart objects, but I didn't bother to go into them in the context of today.
Right.
Yep.
Right. You hear me?
Yes, I can.
On the Photoshop,
you've done the radial mask, can you reverse that? So you can do the inside and the outside, or the outside and the inside?
Probably. Andrew, do
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, you can
Yeah,
invert them. Yeah,
yeah. If you go up to the select tool, up to the select menu, there's an invert option.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And I think also, I'll have to try it, but you know when you created them, it created the marquee tool, and then you
Yeah.
created a mask for it. I think if you'd have clicked on the adjustment you wanted to do, it would have automatically created a mask using your selection.
That's on Lightroom.
Yeah, to be fair, I broke it down into very
Yeah,
simple steps just to illustrate the point. But yes, you're right. There are a lot of shortcuts, and Photoshop will make assumptions based on what you're doing, like that. So yeah, and this technique that I've been showing you is a big thing with Adobe. It's called non-destructive editing, in that everything I was doing I could undo, or I could change, I could reverse out of it. So these are nice techniques to use. Like I made an orange filter, I made an exposure adjustment. I could change the orange filter color if I wanted to. I could change how aggressive it is after the fact. I can go back and rethink it. Some of the other software editing packages, some of the older ones like the Google one, Picasa, and ACDC, some of these programs are not quite as sophisticated as that. And when you make a change, you're making a permanent change to that image. So you then have to think about version control. So duplicate the JPEG before you start, or duplicate the RAW file before you start, so that when you make changes, you've always got the original. Whereas what you've seen me do today, I never touch the original. I've always got a way back to the original picture if I want to. And the other thing that I've found is I make these adjustments, and then 2 years later I go back and decide they were horrendous and I want to change them and readjust them. I don't have to start from scratch. I can go into the PSD file, the Photoshop file, or Lightroom, just go into the picture itself and make the changes without worrying about it. It's just there. It just gives me that flexibility.
Ray, what do you export those as when you come out of like Photoshop?
What I normally do is I normally keep them as Photoshop files within the Lightroom catalog. So if let me just save
PSD.
Yeah, let me just save this one that I've just done. And then I'll go back to sharing the Lightroom catalog, and you'll see what it looks like. Taking forever to save at the moment. Okay, that's saved. So if I now share the Lightroom catalog, you'll now see that I've got two versions. Excuse me. I've got two versions of the fig leaf photo. If I click on this one down here, it says that's the .nef file. That's the raw file. This one, come down here, that's the .psd file. So the way I organize my photos is when I create the PSDs, I use Lightroom to catalog everything for me. But now I don't want to be confused by these two on the screen at the same time. So what I will do is I will flag this as rejected, and it's disappeared. And that's because I'm filtering my view in Lightroom so that the rejected photos don't appear. It's still there. If I turn it off, there it is. It's still there. But I don't want to see it normally. So now from here, I've got a PSD file with all the selective editing and masks and everything else that I wanted. Now when I export it, if I want to print it, I want to publish it on a gallery, I want to enter it into the competition, I will come down here and export it, and then I have the option to export it as a JPEG file, and that's how I would print or share it with the rest of the world. Okay, we're coming up to the hour, and I promised you that we'll keep it under the hour. I hope you found it useful. And what I'm going to do is I'll process this and do a recording of it and publish that as normal. So you can go over it again if you wish to. But then also I'll send an email out with the photo that Paul has donated to this editing exercise.
Is it clean, Paul? Is it clean?
If you don't like it, you can blame Paul. And Paul, do you want to explain where the photo was taken?
It was in Seattle, and obviously on holiday, and we were walking back to the hotel one night, and there was a kind of building site to the left, and there was a guy there, a hobo, and he was just lying there, and he was reading a book. And if you've ever been to America, there's a lot of down and outs in America. The level of poverty is unbelievable, particularly in the big cities. And you very rarely see anyone reading what appeared to me to be quite a decent book. It wasn't Viz or a comic or anything. And I just thought it was a bit contrasty with the building site that was behind. And when you see the picture, you can put your own take on it. But I did my edit on it and sent it through to Ray and explained why I edited it the way I did it. And I thought it'd be interesting to see, without putting ideas in anyone's head, how everyone else does it. And I think we can all learn from each other that way. So that's it, really.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. So what I'm going to do is send you the raw file that Paul sent me without his edits. So I'm not going to influence you. Knock yourself out. Do what you want with it. And
I'll just add that the only camera I had with me was a small Canon G12 bridge camera. So it was I think 12 megapixel that camera is. So it's not, and no interchangeable lens, obviously. But it was just a fairly, what most of you would regard as not very posh camera at all. But it was just one of those holiday snap, really, if you like. So, you know, there's fertile material for everyone, I think, in that photo.
Can't wait to see it.
I'll send it to you as a raw.
It's not that good.
You have a go at it, do whatever you want to it, and then I'll ask you to send it to submissions so that we can put it up on a gallery and show it to the world. No obligation. If you guys don't want to do it, you know, no obligation, but I thought it might be a bit of fun. I thought it was a good idea. And it kind of gelled quite nicely with the last few weeks where we've been just slowly getting more and more into the editing side of things. And I think, you know, you've probably got enough tools now in your arsenal to have a crack at it, and I'd be interested to see the results. So a couple of other points before we wrap. I've been asking you to put your name in the chat window as a way of getting an attendee list. Shana, welcome, hi. You may not know that, but if you just type your name in the chat window, just to give me an attendee list of who comes. But hopefully this will be the last time we have to do that, because it has been avidly making notes. I'm going to mute you all just to Sue has been making notes of all of you, your physigs, but also the names on the screen, and putting that on a checklist that we put together based on the sign-in sheet that we use at meetings. So Sue's volunteered to do that. Stuart, I know you also volunteered, but Sue got there before you. But if you two want to share the job between you, that's fine by me. So we should be keeping an inventory now of who attends these calls, and hopefully from next week I won't have to ask you to put your name in the chat window. Okay, that's all I've got to say. I'll unmute again. Anyone got any more they want to say before we call it a day?
Did Paul say he was using a Canon?
Yeah, he's drummed out of the Nikon club straight away.
That's why it's not a very good picture and needs editing.
You feed him the lines, Peter.
You should just all change to Sony as far as I'm concerned anyway.
Told you again with that one, Paul.
Well, at the time it was the best bridge camera around, so it's probably been superseded by Fuji now, I guess. Or
I have to confess, when it comes to little compact cameras, I'm a Canon user.
yeah.
But you know, as I go to make a decent SLR, then I'm a Nikon user forever.
No.
I'll wait until the R5 comes out.
All right, guys, I'm going to call it a day now. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Ray.
Stay safe.
Bye.
And see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.